Hello, Paul Pounds. We will get on to talking about Ramsey Campbell, but first, a quick word from today's sponsor.
Dogs. Are they friend or foe? Should we love them or regard them as a public nuisance? Dogs on Trial, the big debate in tomorrow's Sunday Mirror. Fancy a big name at your party? It could be costly, but it's not impossible. Read about the great Rent-A-Star boom. The Pearly Princesses, a wonderful collection of royal pictures. Reunion, how adopted children are now able to trace their real mothers. Heartwarming stories. Should Clough become England's new team manager, the big names give their verdict in the marvellous Sunday Mirror tomorrow.
So, regular viewers will know I'm a bit of a fan of Starbucks from the 70s and 80s. And they published a nice little sequence of early Ramsey Campbell stuff. Now, Ramsey's a bit of a legend in horror, I think. I am a fan, so this will be a little bit biased, but I'll try and be critical and break it down and avoid spoilers. I think that's really important, especially for a couple of the novels I'm going to talk about in this video. I've met Ramsey quite a few times and worked with him. Weirdly enough, this is totally off topic, but he, when things were very quiet book-wise, he got a job in like a big book superstore on like a retail park, and I worked for that book chain, going and helped setting up new shops. And yeah, totally off topic, but it's a cool story. I smoked at the time, ran out of cigarettes, and there was no corner shop or anything nearby. So I went to a Mexican restaurant that was just across the way and asked if they could change me a 20. I only had like a 20. Could they give me some change for the cigarette machine? And the lady behind the counter said, "No, I'm sorry, we only open the till for people paying for meals." I'm like, "Oh, all right then." And then the manager came over and she was like, "Actually, I'll deal with this." And she took my money, got some change. She asked me what cigarettes I wanted. She went to the cigarette machine and got me them and then brought them back. And I was thinking, this is pretty good service. I like this. And then she kind of sidled up to me a little bit and went, "It is you, isn't it?" And I was kind of like, who does she think I am? So obviously, I just went, "It is," and walked out, and she was just kind of like, "Oh." And to this day, I have no idea who she thinks I was. I do hope it's someone that isn't associated with some kind of dubious past now. Anyway, back to Ramsey. So Starbucks published Starbucks, not that Starbucks, Starbooks, a different Starbucks. Starbucks reprinted some of his early works in the late 70s and through to the early 80s. Starting with, in 1978, they reprinted The Doll Who Ate His Mother, which is a brilliant title and was slightly reworked for later editions. The Star edition is the kind of unaltered one. Now, if you look online, it's kind of weird. Ramsey is a bit like Marmite. People either really love his stuff or it's just not for them. And I kind of understand why, which I will touch on as we go. So The Doll Who Ate His Mother starts with a car crash and then very quickly unfolds into a very, very strange and unsettling nightmare. And that's like one thing that Ramsey did very, very well. Sometimes when you're reading his stuff, you feel like you've fallen asleep and you're having one of those really unsettling dreams where it's not kind of very obvious horror. Have you ever had those dreams where you're just so uneasy you wake up in a panic? That, for me, is kind of what Ramsey manages to capture in his fiction, which is brilliant. In The Doll Who Ate His Mother, he manages to weave in a kind of sinister, occult subplot, but without it feeling kind of grand and Dennis Wheatley-ish. It's kind of still downbeat and low key. And that's another thing that Ramsey did so well, or does so well. A lot of his stuff is downbeat and gloomy, and he uses the setting of Liverpool as an extra character in the book or in his short stories, which is another reason I really like his stuff. I'm a city boy. I like big cities. The bigger the city, the happier I am. And with that comes brilliant things, brilliant, lively things. But when you get a lot of people crammed together into one city, you also see the worst in people because there's everybody together there. There's no kind of little village neighbours keeping themselves to themselves. Everybody's on display, but still anonymous almost. And yeah, Ramsey brings that. And I guess if you're looking at kind of horror and supernatural stuff, as much as I adore like stately homes and clanking ghosts, it doesn't relate to me living in a big city and that's my day-to-day life. And I think maybe that's why some people don't like his stuff, because if you don't, I don't know, like I love Liverpool. I think Liverpool's a brilliant city. My sister was at university in Liverpool, so when I was at college, because she's a bit older than me, I'd go up most weekends and we'd have a right knees up and it'd be great. So maybe there's an element of kind of big city gloom and it being a city that I'm familiar with. And Ramsey almost wrote like Nigel Neal type characters where you don't always get a likeable hero that's someone that you're rooting for right from the start. Sometimes with Ramsey stuff, it's just people in situations and you're just witnessing this situation from the page. But I think The Doll Who Ate His Mother is it is sinister and downbeat and gloomy. One thing Ramsey gets criticised for kind of online in chat groups and stuff is the ending. And we'll get on to endings a little bit later on in the video. I don't want to kind of go down that path quite yet. So then in 1979, Star reprinted a novel called The Face That Must Die, which is a different thing altogether from The Doll Who Ate His Mother. It's not like a twisty-turny plot at all. It's a study in psychoses, almost. There's nothing supernatural in it. There's nothing supernatural about the main character, Horridge, which has been ruined for me. I don't know if you remember an older TV show, I think from the early 2000s, called Hyperdrive. I absolutely loved it. It was like The Office in space. And there was a kind of TV show within that TV show called Captain Helix, and there was one episode where he had to find a mix of hope and courage, and it was Horridge. And so every time I do go back and reread The Face That Must Die, I always think of Horridge from that. But that's just, sorry, boo, my brain going in different directions. So there's nothing supernatural about The Face That Must Die. It's set in a high rise, and you get that real feeling of claustrophobia as Horridge is totally unravelling. I think it's a wonderful book. And maybe it's I've kind of tried to figure that it gets a little bit of stick online. Some people don't like Ramsey, and everybody's got an opinion to share. me included, obviously. But I really love Italian giallo movies, and the true giallo movies don't have any supernatural elements. It's a terrifying and sadistic murderer. And I think maybe my love of that genre, the Face That Must Die kind of overlaps into that, I think, a little bit. And then in 1980, Star published an anthology edited by Ramsey called The Far Reaches of Fear, which is a really interesting anthology and does throw you a couple of curveballs. There's one story by Ramsey in it, and I thought it was a fascinating thing to read, because it's stories that this chap that writes amazing fiction and picks up on things that are horror keys for me, that spark that unsettling feeling in my brain. This is what gives him that unsettling feeling. And there's no older stuff, it's all like mid-70s stories, so they've got a nice kind of older but modern feel to them. And then Star reprinted in 1980 a short story collection called Demons by Daylight, and in 1981 The Height of the Scream, another short story collection. And right, let's talk about endings. One thing that I really love about Ramsey's work is that the ending isn't always a shocking twist. It's not a narrative smack in the chops as you're like, oh my god, I never thought that had happened. A lot of his stuff is about the journey through the story, which is my favourite way of telling a story. I guess if you look at other examples where people have been wanting a satisfying end, recently Game of Thrones. I haven't seen any Game of Thrones. It's not something I've managed to get round to watching yet, but I do quite fancy it. But there was a lot of people waiting for that glorious end. And this morning I've gone on Facebook and had a cup of tea, and Line of Duty, I think it's a BBC series, I haven't seen that either. Again, people were waiting for this staggering end, and I think for a lot of people it didn't provide that. And if you're looking for that kind of satisfying and brilliant last few minutes, last few pages of whatever you're watching or reading, I think 9 times out of 10 you're probably going to be disappointed. And it's about enjoying getting to the end and maybe having resolution and maybe not. Another example is the film Kill List, the Ben Wheatley film. One of my favourite films, especially favourite modern films, and that just stops. And the fact that it just stops and doesn't wrap anything up or give you a nice satisfying ending is almost sometimes even more shocking than like whatever the author could come up with as a narrative twist or grand conclusion. And I tend to shy away a little bit from fiction like that. One example is Robert Bloch, who was a horror genius, 100%. But a lot of his short stories and even some of the novels, they're like it's the same with EC Comics. I know they're very highly regarded as, you know, like a key moment in the development of horror. But the structure is almost like a joke. You get a build up and then you get the punchline at the end that is the twist. And I find those kind of stories not quite as rereadable as ones that don't try and give you a crazy, amazing ending. It just kind of ends, because it's almost like hearing a joke. So if someone's going to tell you a joke that you've already heard, it doesn't hold your interest, because you've already had the build-up and punchline. Someone else has told you. And I find the same thing with any kind of narrative, be it like movies, TV, books, novels, short stories. If they don't try and give me a crazy end, a satisfying, genius twist end, I kind of like it a little bit better. So, sorry, I was rambling about ends then. So, the Demons by Daylight and The Height of the Scream, that's actually Ramsey's second and third collection of short stories that were originally published by Arkham House. The first one being The Inhabitant of the Lake, which Star didn't reprint, which I'm actually quite glad about. I mean, Ramsey achieved so much so young. He had his first collection of stories published when he was a teenager, which is amazing. But his first collection of stories are really all Lovecraft, either pastiches or homages. And I've been there when I was a teenager, and I discovered Lovecraft and read his stuff avidly and adored this kind of esoteric, surreal, even like psychedelic decades before psychedelia was even a thing. And I think for readers, sometimes it can just become all encompassing. And I think for Ramsey's first collection of short stories, it was a little bit like, you could tell he adored Lovecraft. But with his second and third collection of stories, you can see him spreading his wings a little bit and doing his own thing and putting his own ideas about horror in. And yes, some are like a succinct, almost like joke structure short story, but a lot of them, it's just, he just wants to tell you a sinister and unsettling and disturbing narrative. And his prose is always so beautiful. It kind of dances along the page, but without being pretentious and without being gothic and without being anything like that. It still feels gritty and real and, yeah, totally unsettling. I couldn't find the comment. I read ages ago. I read a comment on. I think he was chatting to someone on a blog, and in the comments, and someone said like, "How do you scare your readers?" And Ramsey replied and essentially said, "I don't try and scare my readers. I try and scare myself, and if it scares me, then I put it out there." So maybe that's why he is a little bit like Marmite. Maybe that's why a lot of people don't like his work that much, because it's a very personal thing to him, and it's unpopular. Like, he does unpopular things. You get characters that you don't really like that much, but they feel real. That's what makes them feel real. You don't always get a satisfying, tremendous, super clever last paragraph that makes you go, "Oh, wow." And a lot of it is northern focused. So maybe that's what appeals to me, and it's the same thing that puts other people off a little bit. But this little collection published by Starbucks, I've loved for ages. The covers are gorgeous. It's really good content. The obviously the Dollaway, his mother, was rewritten a little bit, and there's another edition of The Face That Must Die that Ramsey's written a long introduction for that kind of explains it. And that's kind of cool. It's sometimes nice to get that product, that narrative that's been tinkered with, and someone's gone back to and said, actually, it just needs a little bit more. And sometimes it's nice to have that in its kind of raw form. When Ramsey had that, you know, his career was just starting, and he had that enthusiasm to shock and just get work out there. But they're all awesome, and they make a lovely little set on your shelf. Price wise, they're not super expensive. I don't think they're massively collected. A lot of Ramsey stuff isn't expensive. I collect like hardback first editions of Ramsey stuff, and that does get a bit pricey. But there were so many lovely paperbacks of his stuff out there. Just, it's very affordable. And if you're not familiar with his work, and this video's whetted your appetite, I would probably suggest starting with either one of his short story collections, probably Demons by Daylight, or a book I've not mentioned in this video called Ancient Images, which I think is his most accessible, largely traditional horror, but keeping that dreamlike sense about it. So I shall stop rambling now. Thank you for watching. And if Ramsey ever gets to see this, thank you so much, mate, because you've kept me awake so many nights. Just sat up in bed, little light on, reading brilliant horror. And I will see you all in the next video.